Moreno Valley today houses over 200,000 people and is the second largest city in population in the inland region of Southern California. Life in this desert-like climate has never been easy for humans. Such abundance has rarely been possible before the advent of modern water technology. The first people to come to the area were the indigenous Cahuilla, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, who during winter months left regional mountains and came to the grasslands of what is now Moreno Valley to hunt local game and gather seeds or acorns. This pattern of behavior dates back to at least 300 BC, but indigenous peoples have existed in the area since at least 3000 BC. Underground springs and the waters of the ephemeral Mystic Lake allow them to sustain lives in the year-round warm climate. Around the hillsides of Moreno Valley today are remnants of their society and culture. Rock shelters used for habitation and shielding themselves from either the cold rains of the winter or the heat of the summer and spring, metate and kamule used to grind down seeds, acorns, and other foodstuffs, and the symbols of petroglyphs are painted or carved on nearby boulders or stone as some of the many reminders of their presence that lasted eons in length. It was in the 1500s that Spanish leaders ventured to what is today the western coastline of California and made claim to its land as part of the growing empire. European contact didn't occur with the indigenous peoples of the area until March 1774, when the mapping expedition of Captain Juan Bautista de Anza made its way through Southern California. His efforts led to the establishment of a new trade route to serve the lands of what is now present-day Mexico, Arizona, and California. Anza even camped at Mystic Lake, and in his journal noted the large numbers of birds and waterfowl that existed around it. He continued northward until reaching what is now the San Francisco Bay Area. Anza's route was for centuries used by migrants traveling back and forth between Mexico and the present-day United States. But it was also largely abandoned by Spanish traders due to tensions with indigenous peoples living along the Colorado River. The indigenous peoples surrounding what is today Moreno Valley remained largely isolated for several decades following Anza's arrival from the Spanish presence along the coast. There, the Spanish began to establish the mission system to colonize California and convert its people to the Catholic faith. Some from the region joined them, such as Luiseño at Mission San Luis Rey near Oceanside. It wasn't until the missionaries from Mission San Gabriel near Los Angeles started to enter the region and map its geography in the 1820s that more contact was established. These padres named the regional mountains, such as the San Bernardinos, the San Jacintos, deriving their names from Catholic saints from Europe, such as Saint Bernardine and Saint Hyacinth. Even San Timoteo Canyon was probably named by them during this period. This was the period that during the first time of what is now present-day Moreno Valley was referred to as the San Jacinto Plain because of its flat grasslands. Land grants for the area belonging to Mission San Luis Rey covered present-day Moreno Valley. However, in 1821, revolution removed Spanish control of California, and the new Republic of Mexico was established as a result. Territories once controlled by the Spanish Catholic Church were broken up and divided into large cattle and livestock operations called ranchos, given to wealthy aristocrats and families of Mexican ancestry. Several eventually surrounded what is today present Moreno Valley. Names such as Rancho San Bernardino, Rancho San Timoteo were among them, but the most impactful was Rancho San Jacinto Portero y Nuevo, which was established in 1843 by a man named Jose Estudillo of San Diego. Its lands stand on what is now present-day Lake Perris State Recreation Area and the southern hillsides of Moreno Valley. This land control, however, did not last more than 3 years. In 1846, war broke out between Mexico and the United States, and in 1848, California was brought under the American control. On September 9, 1850, California became its own state, and Americans started journeying west of the Mississippi River by stage, mudflap wagon, on horse, on foot, or otherwise, following trails like the Old Spanish Trail that either passed north of or through Moreno Valley itself. Most notably was the Sonora Trail, which connected Arizona, Mexico, and California. Some of these travelers gave the first English names to what is local geography, such as Box Spring Mountain, for the wooden wells that were built by teamsters under its summit, or Pigeon Pass for the multitudes of mourning doves that once passed through the canyon. Others tried to prospect the local hills for ore to mine, such as copper and tin, with no success. However, remnants of these earliest travelers still remain in the form of abandoned experimental mine shafts and structures that they used to temporarily house themselves. The most notable structure for this time is called the Haslat Adobe, which according to U.S. military survey maps from the time, was formed as early as 1858 among 5 similar structures as a temporary shelter constructed out of local stone and clay found along the hillsides of the Sonora Road. The construction was so sturdy some of them physically remain today. Haslet's identity is not known nor been identified. Decades later, just to the north of the San Jacinto Plain, the first permanent connections to the United States began to appear with the construction of the Second Transcontinental Railroad through San Mateo Canyon, built by the Southern Pacific and beginning in New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1883, the California Southern Railroad, under the ownership of Santa Fe, was completed to the western edge of Box Springs Canyon. Thousands of individuals, who were part of migrant labor from places such as China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and elsewhere, participated in its construction and risked their lives in the process to finish one of the grandest infrastructure projects ever known to be part of the western United States. The arrival of rail traffic brought about a boom of real estate investors and speculators. Railroad boomtowns with familiar names in the present, such as Perris, Elsinore, Menifee, and others soon emerged along them. In 1887, one named Alessandro was developed by citrus ranchers from the Pomona area on a piece of property called the Bourne Tract that stands at the center of what is today the runways of March Air Reserve Base. Moreno Valley's first permanent buildings were constructed in the form of a railroad depot, hotel, post office, houses, and others. The name Alessandro was culturally significant at the time, being the heroic indigenous male lead in Helen Hunt Jackson's famous novel of California, Ramona, which was published in 1883, in part to bring light to the experiences of indigenous people in the western United States. The area first became known as Alessandro Valley for the first time on maps. But real estate speculation doomed the first developers of Alessandro, who assumed that there were large amounts of water underneath the ground in the form of artesian wells. But they quickly found that this was not the reality. But this misfortune did not last long. To the north of Alessandro Valley was a community that had been established a few years earlier called Redlands, and had become a successfully wealthy growing citrus community established by civil engineer and land developer Frank Elwood Brown. Brown had become famous not only in the region but across the country for building the Rock Arc Dam at Big Bear Reservoir in the nearby San Bernardino Mountains, forming then what was then the largest reservoir in the world. Brown and his partners purchased over 25,000 acres of land in Alessandro Valley, with the plan of forming more citrus-growing communities like Redlands. This piece of property was of course called the Alessandro Tract, and the first part of Brown's plan was to reactivate the abandoned railroad town of Alessandro by renovating its buildings. His development created the first major infrastructure for the community, such as its street grid, its irrigation system, the first electrical lines, paved roads, and more. In fact, almost every major street, east to west, is named to the last name of an investor in his Bear Valley Irrigation and Land Company. The one exception is Indian Street, which is named after the indigenous workers who in part helped build this infrastructure on the Alessandro Tract, but also because it geographically led to the Sherman Indian School, which was in Perris at the time. Sherman Indian School was the site of where children from around the southwestern United States were taken from reservations to a state-run boarding school to learn English and effectively become more Americanized, removing their earlier culture. Allegations of abuse, neglect, illness, and death were common at facilities of this kind. The school, due to water issues, eventually relocated in 1893, but the similar experience continued on for decades. Back in Alessandro, Frank Brown's company hired the likes of Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of American landscape architecture, and the designer of some of the most famous parks in the United States, such as Central Park in New York City or the Presidio in San Francisco, to lay out the streets of the new Alessandro. Simultaneously, 5 miles to the east of Alessandro, was to be another community called New Haven, after Brown's hometown in Connecticut, and close to where he attended engineering college at Yale University. Frank Brown, however, was a popular figure among his investors, who pressured him to renaming the town after himself. As a compromise, he agreed to name it after his last name in Spanish, Moreno, in October of 1891. From this point going forward, the geographic name of the valley would become Moreno Valley. To irrigate both areas and make the citrus communities a reality, Brown designed and had built the 10-mile steel pipeline to collect runoff from the nearby San Bernardino Mountains as a water supply. Because it needed to be slowed after it entered the hills and mountains heading southward, A separate 6-foot-tall, half-mile-long Moreno tunnel was constructed out of brick. This project was the longest continuous water infrastructure project of its kind in the country. While Brown's company designed the infrastructure, it was the back-breaking manual labor of various individuals of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, from Native Americans to white New Englanders, Latinos, and immigrants from China and Japan, working together for the common goal of building it so that a community could grow. Brown had very noble intentions, but between natural drought and internal squabbling of the company and the neglect of its irrigation system, it eventually failed and caused problems with the delivery of water to not only Moreno Valley, but other communities such as Riverside, San Bernardino, Redlands, and elsewhere. Lawsuits and court battles occurred, and by 1900, access for Moreno Valley to Big Bear's water was cut off permanently. Most residents who had come to the area, many of them New England natives, had to leave for elsewhere as a result, other places such as Riverside or Perris that had access to either the water of the Santa Ana River or wells of their own. Alessandro was immediately entirely abandoned, and Moreno only survived because ranchers planted dry crops and dug local wells of their own, probably some of the same used by indigenous peoples for centuries prior. Brown lost his personal fortune, which in today's money would amount to almost $20 million. However, he went on to continue his engineering career, helping develop the Sweetwater Reservoir near San Diego, as well as the LA Aqueduct before passing away in 1914. He is buried in nearby Redlands as a reminder of his dreams and ambitions for this very dry and arid part of California. In 1901, Jackrabbit Trail was built by the county as the first automobile highway through the area and was phased through Moreno. It was used for decades by automobiles and drivers passing through the greater Los Angeles area to the desert communities, including Palm Springs. It was decommissioned in 1985, but physical remnants of this frontage road still exist today. Following the implosion of the Bear Valley Irrigation Project in Moreno Valley, Pennsylvania industrialist Eli Hendrick in 1903 bought massive Alessandro Tract and was able to dig new wells in the canyons and the hills surrounding Moreno Valley. Farming and ranching was able to successfully continue and grow. Hendrick purchased the property, expanding on land he already owned in Riverside in the 1890s, in the hopes of building the largest orange grove under one ownership in the world. Hendrick never lived in the area permanently. He wintered and often stayed at the famous Mission Inn in Riverside. He purchased the buildings of the former town of Alessandro, making them into his ranching headquarters. Hendrick's time in the valley, though, was very brief. He himself passed away in 1903, leaving his large estate to his 2 daughters. But he started one of the largest ranching operations of its kind in the region. Following this success, others soon continued to come to the area from Los Angeles. A group of land investors, led by a Mr. Mead, founded the Sunnymead Tract in 1913 in the hopes of continuing with citrus growing. And activity continued as the United States found itself caught up in the First World War in 1917. The U.S. Army Air Corps started looking across the United States with the hopes of building an airfield needed to train pilots to fight in Europe. Originally, they started looking for sites around the Fort Worth, Texas area, but business people from Riverside, including that of Frank Augustus Miller, the owner and founder of the Mission Inn, to promote and build near Riverside instead. Miller himself was very familiar with Moreno Valley, having owned orange groves there, and he also knew the Hendrick family who stayed at his hotel. As a result, the U.S. government purchased 640 acres of the Hendrick Ranch to build March Field. The facility was named after the son of the former Secretary of War, Peyton March, Jr., who had recently passed away in a plane crash in Texas in 1918. The first barracks and buildings, in fact, were once the ranching headquarters and structures once part of the original town of Alessandro. Following the First World War, the community of Edgemont, which was built along the western edge of Box Springs Mountain, was founded by poultry ranchers from the Los Angeles area. March Field continued to grow into the 1930s as well. It was soon discovered that March Field was a very convenient place for Hollywood and politicians to come out and either make films or documentaries. An individual named Henry Hap Arnold became the base commander of March Army Airfield and invited many celebrities, including Amelia Earhart, Clark Gable, and others, to make film and radio productions based at March Field. In 1941, comedian and actor Bob Hope even held his first USO comedy tour at March Field. This organization would continue to perform for decades after, all over the world. Hap Arnold himself used his career at March to eventually become the first general of the United States Air Force in 1947. Of course, despite all this activity, nothing could compare to the outbreak of American entry into World War II in 1941. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, March greatly expanded and would eventually house up to 85,000 personnel on its own at its peak. Across US 395, the U.S. Army also developed Camp Han in 1942 to provide basic training and procedures on how to use anti-aircraft artillery equipment in combat. Tens of thousands of soldiers and personnel came in and out by rail and vehicle during this time from all over the United States. Both facilities even held Italian and German prisoners of war during the conflict, and many new pieces of construction happened during it, including that of an infirmary developed by the Red Cross that would be used for decades after, and still stands today as one of Moreno Valley's most significant surviving landmarks. While all this military activity was going on across Southern California, nearby Moreno Valley, Mystic Lake, and Nuevo were subsequently farmed at the time by Japanese Americans, dating back to the Great Depression. Because of prejudice and fears during the time, many of them were required to relocate to internment camps in desert communities such as Poston or Manzanar during the duration of the war, and were never able to return to their lost property or claims. With the war's end and Allied victory, Camp Han closed fully in 1946, and buildings were later sold off for civilian use. Several barracks still survive as structures in Moreno Valley, Perris, Riverside, and Nuevo today, including the Edgemont Community Center. Even an abandoned rifle range with graffiti from soldiers stationed there in 1943 remains protected from this time period. In 1947, the newly created March Air Force Base was added with the newest branch of the United States military. And with the beginnings of the Cold War and the arms race with the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons and jet aircraft, including long-range bombers, were soon assigned to this location. The land once used for Camp Han became a golf course frequented by celebrities, including Bob Hope. But as before, growth and development was not ever easy, caused the final abandonment of Frank Elwood Brown's Moreno Tunnel in 1953, which had been operated since by Eli Hendrick's Moreno Mutual Water Company. Voters, tired of drought and instability, voted to approve a bond measure that would allow the Colorado River Aqueduct, which had been built through the area during the Great Depression, to provide water to the communities of Edgemont, Sunnymead, and Moreno. But despite all this hardship, there was still time for fun and enjoyment in Moreno Valley. Visitors to the base often saw the creation of professional racing events on the runways of March Air Force Base, including and attracting many people from Hollywood and business people from Los Angeles, once again including the likes of Bob Hope. In 1957, this attention eventually led to the creation of Riverside International Raceway, built next to Edgemont and just north of March Air Force Base, where world-famous racing competitions, including the Indy 500 and NASCAR, were held for the next 3 decades. It continued to be a draw for Hollywood, bringing in film productions such as The Love Bug and others for many years to come. And as this growth occurred, Moreno Valley in the 1950s and 60s itself became a much more urban area, with Air Force families increasingly moving in. Former Oklahoma Governor Robert S. Kerr opened the Kerr Stock Farm in Moreno to breed racing horses, and in November of 1963, 3 days before he was assassinated, President John F. Kennedy received a turkey bred in Sunnymead at a ranch at the White House as the first bird that would be spared during the traditional Thanksgiving meal. The state of California saw the need to improve and make more efficient its state highway system, and in 1964 it took the route that was first established as State Route 60 in the 1930s to build a more modern and highway that exists today. In 1966, a dirt capital letter M was placed on the South Springs Mountain as a high school booster club project to honor the growth and unity that had been shown in Moreno Valley. It would be cemented over in the 1980s as a permanent landmark. With the advent and the addition of automobile activity through the area, Santa Fe Railroad suspended passenger train service to Perris and Marchfield Station in 1966, and freight during the early 1980s. In fact, the last portion of the massive Hendrick Ranch operation was sold to Los Angeles-based real estate developer in 1969 to build a housing tract, a tradition that would continue for decades after. In the 1970s, California saw the need itself to have a more sustainable water supply to encourage growth and economic development in the state, as well as to prevent future droughts, not to mention the threat that seismic activity posed if a major earthquake had erupted in the region. As a result, Governor Edmund G. Brown commissioned the State Water Project, the largest system of its kind in the world, even in the present. A new reservoir, Lake Perris, opened at the southern end of this system in 1973. Governor and later U.S. President Ronald Reagan held the dedication ceremony. A new state park and wildlife area on the lands that were once part of Rancho San Jacinto and Nuevo in the 1840s was developed as a result. US 395 became Interstate 215 in 1975, and access to water and former cheap ranching land brought developers to the area in the 1980s. They constructed houses, commercial centers, parks, and more, bringing affordability to those seeking to leave the urban centers of Los Angeles and Orange County for a more open and rural lifestyle. By 1983, the population boomed to over 40,000 people. Enough were coming to the area that there was great pressure to merge the communities of Moreno, Edgemont, and Sunnymead into a single unified city, although efforts to incorporate a city had existed since the 1920s without success. And after many attempted votes, in November of 1984, voters approved the creation of the city of Moreno Valley, which officially formed on December 3, 1984. The urbanization didn't cease. Moreno Valley would endure bust and boom cycles with real estate development and speculation, much as it had with the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s. Multiple times, Moreno Valley was named the fastest growing city in the United States, but the expansion cost the existence of many local landmarks and history that had existed for decades. Riverside International Raceway, Kerr Stock Farm, and many ranching operations eventually were all lost to development by the 1980s. Soon following, the end of the Cold War also meant the reduced need for an active Air Force. March Air Force Base went through base realignment and construction, or BRAC, and was scaled down in operation. By 1996, it was made into an Air Reserve base. And by 2020, most of the former land that had once served as an Air Force base had been redeveloped by the county under the March Joint Powers Authority with new offices, industrial sites. Former land of Camp Hahn in the golf course came Riverside National Cemetery. Passenger rail service and civilian flight returned as well, with the expansion of Metrolink down to the Menifee area from Riverside, on rail lines first built by migrant labor in the 1880s as part of the California Southern Railroad. By 2022, Moreno Valley's population continued to soar to more than 200,000 people. It is so large that by 2016 it even elected its first citywide mayor, and by 2030 is projected to have over 300,000 people. Even though most of the city has become very urban, with sprawl and development, there are still many physical reminders of its former and agrarian past, from the 1920s Mission Revival School in Moreno to olive trees planted decades ago by workers during its heightened ranching operation. Even the home of Eli Hendrick's ranching headquarters remains today, as well as the physical remnants of the Moreno Tunnel. All of these pieces and elements are physical reminders that life in this community was never easy, nor was growth or prosperity, and there were always many ups and downs. But they survive as a testimony to how far the people that came to Moreno Valley came over time. They have endured for centuries and been able to find success and some joy in one of the most dry and arid regions in the world.